If you're on Facebook, now you can follow Notebook on Cities and Culture on its official Facebook page. Take a look at facebook.com/Notebook on Cities and Culture. Season 3 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. You mentioned you have a theory as to why Mexican literature, Spanish language literature, might now be at its best time, which as a reader seems true to me, but I don't know why. So why do you think?
Well, in Mexico, the culture used to be linked a lot towards politics. The ruling party would always try to cooptate the biggest intellectual figures. Some of them were even ambassadors in foreign countries, in important countries. They would be ambassadors in London, they would be ambassadors in Spain, or in further away countries like Sergio Pitol, which is probably the brightest literary figure of the 20th century. He was ambassador in Poland, he was ambassador in Russia, and there was like this big, massive weight of the intellectuals in the Mexican society. But the intellectuals were like big totems, and they would get to choose
Invincible.
Yeah, exactly. And untouchable. There's like these figures that would be, dictating what should we be thinking, what should we be reading, what should we be seeing, etc., etc. And then, there was a generation of very big, bright writers and publishers that were commanded by Octavio Paz, and then after that there was like the generation after Octavio Paz and after all these good writers like Salvador Elizondo, Alejandro Rossi, etc. I think they lived under the shadow of this very big giant, who were untouchable and who you can argue against them. And I think there was a span for about, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 years under which there were hardly like original, powerful, motivating writers. There were a few. I mean, there are some good exceptions, like we were talking just now about Juan Villoro or Mario Bellatin, which are, of course, I think very brilliant writers. But, I think just now there's a young generation of writers who have just outgrown the shadow of this of the intellectual of their intellectual fathers, and they are responding as well. That's one reason. And the other reason, I think, is that they are responding as well, to what we experience in Mexico as a total social meltdown. What's happening in Mexico is even worse than what the news are. Sometimes you get the news that travel outside of the borders are usually the nastier ones, and sometimes they're a bit exaggerated or nuanced or biased, but not in the case of the Mexican reality. The news that travel abroad are actually milder than the reality especially in I would say 30-40% of the territory. It used to be only in the northern part of Mexico, next to the border with the United States, but now it has spread all around. And I mean, the reality there is like, I don't know even how to describe it. I don't know a word for it, but it's like total absence of governmental power. There are many, not one, not two, not three, but 10 different criminal groups collecting taxes from people. They have like pretty much the exclusive force of the exclusive use of force in a lot of cities where the police cannot go in. So it's pretty bad, it's pretty chaotic. And I believe that not only in literature, but in other artistic fields, like in contemporary art or even in cinema, it's like a way of the people for responding to this. It's like I think that the cultural realm is our first front line in trying to stand up against this whole thing, which has been going for years. I mean, this is the result. What's going on in Mexico right now is the result of many decades of total abuse of power, of corruption, of an indecent and abusive wealth distribution. Mexico, I believe it's right now, it's like the 13 economy of the world. It's a pretty big economy, but it's also a country where there are more than 50 million people living under the line of poverty. So the wealth distribution is a serious problem, and that's been going on for a lot of decades until people found a way to have a better life through the cartels, through the drug cartels. So there is no possibility for the government to respond to this, because it's the result of, as I said, of decades of ignoring these people. They have no education, they have no access to health, they have no access to decent jobs. So what the hell, they go and say, why shouldn't I join this drug cartel? I mean, it's either that or be a slave for the rest of my life. So I believe that the literature we are seeing right now is pretty much the result of all this, mess, like this trying to articulate a new reality through the creation of literature, trying to articulate, a way to denounce, to denounce what's going on, because it's something has to be done, and I believe that this is our first response to this meltdown.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down here in Colonia, Roma, in one of my favorite cities in the world, Mexico City, with Diego Rabasa, who, with his brother Eduardo, runs Sexto Piso, which has been called one of the most innovative and certainly coolest presses in Mexico, and has recently celebrated, by the way, its 10th anniversary. It has survived where many presses do not. Now, Diego, you describe this mess and the literary response to this mess. Does that mean that writers can say things they could never say before?
Well, there is a bit of that, but I'm not sure if censorship was ever a big issue in Mexico. I mean, we didn't have a dictatorship like the one they had in Chile or in Argentina or in Brazil or in many other countries in Latin America. We had a different kind of dictatorship where censorship wasn't like the biggest deal. I believe that people, like general people, are trying to cope with reality, and the fact that there are people describing it in very creative ways, in very artistic ways, it just allows people to feel like to understand a little bit better this anxiety that arises from living in a country like this. We are just fed up with every day in the news you see a new abuse by a governor, from some province in Mexico City. We see a new abuse by some leader of the unions, and I believe that people are finding some relief, in seeing that somebody is expressing everything that's going on. So as I was saying, I don't think that it has to do with censorship. I think that it rather has to do with the fact that people are connecting better with what people are doing right now, because they feel that it represents what they're going through. The everyday sorrow and the desperation of seeing that the things not only do not get better, but they are getting worse and worse.
Do you think that everybody in Mexico City, rich and poor, feels more insecure than in other places?
What do you mean other places?
Other cities, other cities in the world, other cities in North America or other cities in Latin America. Is this a place where people, all of them, just feel more insecure because of what you've said?
Are you talking about Mexico City or Mexico in general?
Well, it depends. Tell me this. How much of a difference is there? Should we say in Mexico City people feel a certain way, in Mexico in general people feel a different way? Certainly at the border it's worse. But how much of a difference is there between life in Mexico City and the many different kinds of life outside it?
It's very, very, very big difference. It's a funny paradox. I would say about 15 years ago, I have a lot of family in the provinces, and they would never want to come to Mexico City because it was so dangerous, the big city, and it was filled with dangers, and there were like robberies and assaults and kidnapping and blah, blah, blah. And then the city began to get better, as I was saying. Since the left took over about 18 years ago, the city began to get better and better and better, and the whole country began to get worse, worse, and worse. And so the general idea and the general feeling, I would say 2 or 3 years ago, was that Mexico City became the safest city in the country. And it became safer. It did become safer. I mean, it's gradually beginning to get infected with the insecurity that happens in other cities, but the stories that you hear in some cities, you have to go to a border. You have to go to Cuernavaca, which is an hour away from Mexico City, or you have to go to Acapulco, which is 3 hours away from Mexico City. Just a few weeks ago, 6 Spanish tourists got raped in a beach an hour away from Acapulco. In Veracruz, which is 3 hours away from here, we've had massacres of 20, 30, 40 people and bodies being dropped out in the street, but not in the outskirts or in the suburbs, but right in the middle of the most touristic places, We don't have that in Mexico. We don't have massacres. We don't have like gunfighting. We don't have shops being burnt down, which is happening in other cities in the country. We don't have that here. We have like smaller crimes, have like robberies and all that. But I would definitely say that Mexicans feel that we are living in one of the most dangerous countries in the world.
You mentioned to me before we recorded, you grew up in childhood, you felt things were a little dull, but you grew up in a fairly well-off environment. Would you say that?
Yeah, my family used to, with which I'm not related anymore. They used to be politics, and so we grew up in a well-off environment. I wouldn't say like incredibly rich, but it was certainly a posh area, and they used to. All my family used to be linked with the PRI, which was, as I was telling you, it was the ruling party in Mexico for 70 years. So we grew up in a very conservative environment, and we didn't get to know the Mexican reality until we were older. And once we started
You had your own reality.
Yeah, we had our own reality, which was probably no different than yours or than any other people in the United States or somewhere else. But I mean, we could see, we're not stupid. I mean, we did know what kind of country we lived in, and but we didn't actually experience, the social tragedy of the country. And it wasn't until we got older that we managed to separate ourselves from our family and just started, getting to know the country we live in, and this is. As I was saying to you, this has been going on since the Mexican Revolution. It's not a new reality. It's just like the degradation has gotten worse and worse and worse and worse, and we got up to this point. But it's the way that it's pretty much the way the nation was conceived. It has a very perverse relationship with the United States, and that perverse relationship with the United States has reached its highest point in terms of. We supply drugs and they supply weapons, so that's pretty bad. That's a pretty bad equation for us, because there are more killings in Mexico than in the past 6 years, and in both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars combined together. All the guns with which these killings are happening come from the United States. So. It's a very complex relationship. We've never really achieved, I believe, like an independence, in ideological terms, in economical terms, in terms of configuring a society that doesn't want to imitate the notion of progress that they have in the United States. Here we have a very big indigenous population, which has different languages. Many of them don't even speak Spanish. They have like different ways of conceiving reality, and we are forcing, which is pretty much happening everywhere in the world. Like forcing all the countries to imitate a model of economical development, which is ignoring huge portions of the population in Mexico.
Growing up, did you have interest in either literature or the social situation in Mexico, or both, or did those interests come later?
They did come later. My mother was a big reader, and we were fond of books since we were little, but I didn't feel passionate about them. You know, I think that my father and other relatives from my family, they would have expected us to be economists or lawyers. You know, there are a lot of lawyers in my family, so this thing of the passion for books, the passion for reading, the passion for literature and culture didn't come up until we were, I would say, nearly 20 years old, so it came late.
And you studied to be an engineer, did you not?
I did. I am an electrical engineer, and imagine this. I started studying electrical engineering, and my brother started studying economics. So when we started college, we were pretty much on the expected track.
Right. Professionals.
Exactly. And then my brother shifted to political science. He went to the National University at UNAM, and I changed to philosophy, and everything got diverted there.
Do you remember, were there certain books, certain writers you read that made you think, there's a world in literature that I need to explore and that I need to be a part of?
Sure. I remember that the first book that made me realize that literature is not just a mere representation of life, but it can interfere with life, change it, and alter it, was Juan Rulfo. Pedro Páramo, of course, is a masterpiece, but it was more specifically El Llano en Llamas, which is this short stories collection, and it showed me the Mexico that had been hidden away from me. You know, it's about the, like, I would say, if there's such a thing as the real Mexico. I mean, one can no longer. I believe that one can no longer speak about a country and just englobe in a nationality all the immense richness and diversity of a culture. I mean, how would you say which is the American ideology? I mean,
impossible,
and it's the same. I believe it's the same pretty much everywhere else. But I would say that the larger portions of Mexico have a similar reality to the one Juan Rulfo depicted than the one I grew up in.
What do you remember about Juan Rulfo's writing that made you think, oh, that's how it really is? What did he reveal?
This the way the atmosphere, the way the characters talk.
Would we think of this as the low life? Like, were his characters criminals, or were they what part of society were they in?
It's more like the rural Mexico. You know, it's not like the low life, but more the rural part of Mexico. But you know, Mexico, it's a very big country, and it doesn't have many big cities, and the cities are incredibly conservative, and I mean, it's not a country that has a lot of urbanization, and pretty much large parts of the population still live in the country in pretty harsh conditions, and that's the Mexico Juan Rulfo depicts. It's also the Mexico that I would say, you know, a writer called Daniel Sada.
Oh yes, he's getting known. His work is getting known in the United States.
Well, he's awesome. He's a very, very, very brilliant writer, and I think that he was like he took the legacy of Rulfo and he carried it through the contemporary times. And many of the writers that I believe are creating this scene where Mexican literature is becoming more and more interesting are disciples of Daniel Sada. You know, so it's like a rising new life from this forgotten part of Mexican society, which is rural Mexico. You know.
Reading more and more, what did you notice was missing in the available Spanish language literature in Mexico that you wanted to provide, that you and your collaborators in Sexto Piso wanted to provide?
Well, many things, because in the 70s, when Spain was still under a dictatorship with Franco, pretty much the Spanish-speaking edition was done here in Mexico. It was like by far the biggest market for publishers, for writers, for readers. Then there was Argentina, and in a distant third place it was Spain. But then after Spain opened up, I think that we because we have a big education and a big literacy problem here in Mexico. I mean, we have 100 million people here, but 30 million people can't read or write. And there are, it's, as I said, it's a very uneducated society. Spain took over. And then here in Mexico, it was very hard to have a publishing project with which you could do translations, or you could do like ambitious projects. So we would only get, with a 6 or 8 month delay, what the Spanish editors wouldn't be able to sell in Spain. So there was like a big hole in Mexican publishing. There still is, you know. And so I believe that, but the former generation of independent publishers in Mexico used this as an excuse to say like a risky, innovative, modern publishing house is not doable in Mexico. It just can't be done because there aren't enough readers, because there aren't enough bookstores, because it just can't be done. So it was pretty much the place was pretty much for us to do what our imagination would dictate, and so we started doing translations of some writers that were not very well known in Mexico but were very important, like the Italian writer Roberto Calasso, for instance. We did some things in our non-fiction collection which were like hardline writing, like the German philosopher Max Stirnitz, a 19th century philosopher. And then after that, we just realized that the Mexican people were eager to get to know things that were out of the of the commonplace. We started translating from Serbian. We translated an Israeli writer. We started translating from the Arab, from many different languages, and we found out that people were very receptive of this, because this wasn't it wasn't common for them to find in a Mexican bookstore all these new, fresh propositions, and it just I think it was I wouldn't say pretty easy because it's been pretty hard, but in terms of choosing the titles, that's been the easiest part, I think.
Would you say there is a hunger for specifically foreign ideas in Mexico, to know what the rest of the world is thinking, to bring the outside world into Mexico in some literary sense or intellectual sense?
It used to be like that, but not anymore, because here because in many places people couldn't find like a big diversity of titles, people would manage. They would either get illegal PDFs on the web, or they would get books by Amazon, or they would get they would have friends living abroad bringing books to Mexico. So when we start, because for the first 5 or 6 years we hardly published any Mexican writer. We started off just doing translations, and when we started opening up with what was going on here with the writers in Mexico, we realized that there was a huge generation of writers that were incredibly cult, which had like very original ways of approaching the literary creation. And so I don't think that foreign ideas were missing in Mexico. I'm talking about the writers, and so I believe that it's more like how can I put it? Because it's not like bringing foreign ideas to Mexico, but it's more like feeling that we are like as original as anybody can be. I mean that we don't have like there aren't things running around in other places that we don't read here, that we don't have access to here in Mexico. But I'm contradicting myself a little bit, but I wouldn't say that it's in terms of ideas. It's not ideas what we were missing. I think it's like more in an aesthetic point of view that we were lacking diversity. But the Mexican people, I must say that the Mexican readers, I must say, are very keen to supporting Mexican writers. Since we started publishing Mexican writers, some of the Mexican writers that we've published have been the most successful ones in our publishing house. I mean, we have a Mexican writer from Torreon, which is like the most violent city in the country, and he's published 2 collections of short stories, and both we're running the 4th edition in one and the 3rd edition in another, and this is just happened in a 3-year span. We published a young writer called Valeria Luiselli, which is doing a PhD in Colonia, and she's published 2 books, and both of them have been edited like 3, or one of them is going in its 3rd edition and the other one is going in its 2nd edition. We have Mario Bellatin, who has also been very successful. So Mexican readers are keen on getting to know what Mexican writers are doing.
I want to know more about the Mexican readers, specifically Mexicans who read very enthusiastically. And you mentioned they like to support Mexican writers, but it seems like when I come to Mexico City, I like to go to bookstores because the bookstores you have here are so interesting. We're sitting in one right now that I like, and there's several of this specific chain, but I like to go to the used bookstores on Donceles, downtown as well. What?
Donceles.
Donceles. Yeah, see, this is the kind of thing I need to practice while I'm in Mexico. Donceles. That's where the bookstores are that are the used bookstores. But how is it that there's so many people who can't read, and there's some people who are enthusiastic about reading, but is it just them who can support so many good bookstores?
But I wouldn't say that there are so many good bookstores. There are less bookstores in whole Mexico than they are in Barcelona. I think we have a huge problem of bookstores here in Mexico, and there are some few good bookstores and they are basically supported by a very enthusiastic, progressist middle class that still lives, and I think that's the backbone of the Mexican cultural activity. But there aren't many. I would say that there are like good, independent bookstores. There aren't more than 10, in Mexico City, and there are probably a handful of them in the province. But what I would say is that we have an office in Spain as well. We opened up an office in Madrid about 5 years ago, and when we started the project in Spain, we figured that we would just translate our project. We would just replicate the project from Mexico to Spain, and we realized that many of the best-selling authors we have here in Mexico wouldn't sell 200 books in Spain. It's a much more conservative market. I mean, here our best-selling authors are Milorad Pavic from Serbia, Goran Petrovic from Serbia, Edgar Queret from Israel, and whereas in Spain our best-selling books are a compilation of short stories by Rudyard Kipling, an illustrated edition we did by of the Great Gatsby, a collection. Original English language writers translated. Not only English writers, also French writers or British authors or German authors, but more of a classical profile. We've had a hard time introducing new writers in Spain, and here they are the most popular ones. So, as I was saying, I think that the Mexican readers are riskier. They are more willing to get to know an author that they don't know. They are willing to bet on an exotic writer, and in Spain there's more like a canon of what the readers are looking for especially in the fiction in the fiction field. So in Mexico, I would say that there's a combination of readers who support the Mexican writers and who are seeking for different things, you know.
They'll try anything.
Well, they'll try anything, and I think that that is also linked with the question with which we began. You know, we are trying to articulate a different reality, and I believe that we are trying to articulate a different reality with different sources of information. I mean, we can't articulate a different reality, we know, by reading Proust or by reading Dickens, which we love, for sure, you know. But we are trying to find a way to lead our lives in a different way, and I think that eagerness to find something different, to differentiate ourselves from what we are experiencing in real life. We are trying to differentiate ourselves from our past, and I think that is a boost for publishing houses that are trying to introduce new writers from like distant countries. You know, I think that explains our close relationship with unknown writers.
I've read that the name of your press, Sexto Piso, refers to the floor at which, if you jump, you will certainly die. Is this true?
It's true. Yeah.
Why is that the inspiration? Which the floor you will die from?
Well, I'd hope to have a more poetic or intellectual response to that question, but it's actually a pretty childhood thing. You know, the publishing house started out in 2002 during the World Cup in Japan and Korea, and we're all big soccer fans. And so the games would be at 4 in the morning, 6 in the morning, so we just stay up all night drinking, and then would see the games, and then the next morning would have to go to work. And then one of these days, we were all hammered, one of our fellows, or one of the guys who started out the publishing house said, "Oh, I would rather jump out from a 6th floor to go to the office today." You know, and we started using this expression like, "Oh, I would rather jump from the 6th floor than going to have dinner with my mother-in-law," or, you know, all these things. And then when we started out the publishing house, we said like, well, we just do it, and if we can't make it, we'll finally jump out from the 6th floor. Yeah.
And presses, from what I've read, don't usually make it in Mexico. Is it by 3 years they're usually done?
Yeah, well, no, usually I mean, there are, every year, I don't have I don't know the statistic with precision, but it's something like this. It's something like every year there are about 25, 30 publishing projects that begin, which are not only about publishing books, but only about doing magazines and all that. And by the end of the year, only 1 or 2 survive. And by the end of 3 years, only 1 of them survives. So it's like the radio is 1 among 30 survive after the 3rd year. And I think it has to do with what I was telling to you before. There aren't many bookshops in Mexico, so it's pretty hard to to be able to finance the costs of a book, you know, to pay the advance to an author, to pay the translation, to do like a good edition of the book, because like the average run of a literary title in Mexico, I would say that ranges between 2,000 and 3,000 copies, you know, which is not a lot. So if you do such a small run, then the prices of the books have to be higher than what the people can pay, because, you know, we are basically a poor country, and even the middle class, I mean, I would say like an average wage here in Mexico for the middle class would go between $800 and possibly $1,500. With that, you have to pay everything. I mean, rent, blah blah blah. And so there's not like there's not a big space for in the individual economy to spend in culture and to spend in books or to spend in theaters or to spend in the movies. That's why like piracy is so big in Mexico, you know. And I'm not entirely against it, because it's the only way that huge parts of the population can have access to to cultural manifestations, so it's difficult. It's hard to get a project like this one going, even though I must say that the Minister of Culture spends a lot of money supporting publishing projects like the one we have. That is good and bad. It's good because many projects can have like a lift through their first years of existence, and it's bad because many projects they rely entirely on the governmental funds, and they don't preoccupy themselves with reaching an audience, with just going to the bookshops, promoting their books.
So stop thinking directly about the readers.
Exactly, they stop thinking directly. That's exactly it. And then suddenly, 1 year, you don't get the funding that you were expecting for. That's it. You're done.
You mentioned opening the branch of Sexto Piso in Madrid 5 years ago. Do you think it's necessary for a Mexican press to have a presence in other Spanish-speaking, Spanish-reading countries as well?
I think for a project like ours, it is. And I will tell you why. Because, it's very difficult to live out of discovering the unknown writer whose rights are pretty cheap because nobody knows who he is. I mean, we've managed to live with that model for a few years, but after a while you want to compete for other more important writers, and if you want to compete for more important writers, you have to have a presence in the biggest Spanish market, which is Spain, and you have to have a presence in Argentina, which is a pretty big market too, and it's a pretty cult and well-educated market too in Argentina. So I will give you 3 examples. Last year we've published 3 writers, well-known writers who had won like awards and blah blah blah, like were John Lee Anderson, the journalist of the New Yorker. We published Frank Goldman, who also writes in New York and wrote a novel called Say Her Name last year, which was moderately big in the United States and won a big award in France. And we published an American writer who published his first novel, but who was a finalist for the National Book Award, called Kevin Powers. He did a novel called The Yellowbirds, which is about the Iraq War. And we couldn't have gotten those rights if we didn't have an important presence in Spain and Argentina. So I perceive that our publishing house is like an adolescent right now. We're no longer childs, but we're not adults yet. But if you want to, a teenager, if you want to grow out of childhood, and if you want to grow out of being a teenager forever, you have to have a bigger commercial impact, and you can't do it. You can't rely on having that only in Mexico.
Of course, Sexto Piso recently had its 10th anniversary, and felicidades. But I've heard that your press throws a good party, and I imagine there was a good party when the 10th anniversary happened.
Well, the parties have been a very important thing in our project. We do one every year, and we're good at organizing parties. What can I say?
Do presses have parties generally in Mexico City? Are you always going to some presses party, or are you the guys who are doing that?
Well, they have like these boring cocktails, these pretentious cocktails with old people in suits just talking in low voices. I think we're not the only ones, but I think that we are one of the best of doing so. And it's proven to be a great way to promote the publishing house. We have a party here in Mexico City, but we have a very big party in Guadalajara in the book fair, and we always do it in a very small place, so we can't allow more than 200 people. And it's always we always find out that there was last year a very famous TV presenter in Mexico got left out, and we had like big writers trying to get in. They can't get in, so it just created some sort of mysticism around the whole thing. Just it's not a very important thing, but I mean we try to have fun at doing what we do. It's the everyday life of a publisher is not as glamorous as many people might think. We spend a lot of time reading on our own, going to bookshops, speaking to journalists, trying to convince, an unprofessional, because in Mexico City, bookshops, distributors, and sometimes even journalists are not as professional as one would hope. No, right. So many times you have to do your job and a part of their job. You have to convince them that this and that product are important for this and that reasons, and that they should transmit this or that message to the audience. It's not always the case. There are some great there are some great bookshops, and there are some great journalists, but I wouldn't say it's the rule. In general, it's so.
For people who don't come from Mexico, but who want to understand Mexico, and people, especially readers who want to understand Mexico City, what writers do you think they should be reading?
Well, as I said, most of the most interesting writers right now are talking about many of them come from the northern part of Mexico, and they are talking about the Mexican reality in those parts, which, to understand Mexico, I think that you should be able to get a grasp of what's going on there. I would recommend a writer who's a very brilliant writer who's been published in France by Gallimard and in England by Faber, and it's been picked up by many of the most prestigious publishing houses in the world, which is called Yuri Herrera. He has 3 books, and they are all novels, and they all somehow are related with I would say it's related somehow to the low. What's the expression you use?
Low life.
Low life, exactly. So, the first 2 happen in the northern part of Mexico. The third one happens in Mexico City, but they are a very good representation of the things with which the average Mexican has to deal in an everyday life. Yuri Herrera, I would say, it's one of the best. There is another Mexican writer, the one I was telling you about, that comes from Torreon, which is a very he likes to see himself as a disciple from the Beat generation and from Hunter Thompson and all that. So he's like this very, very energetic, innovative, very original writer. He's called Carlos Velázquez. He has 2 books. One of them is called La Biblia Vaquera, which is the Western Bible, and the second one is called La Marrana Negra de la Literatura Rosa, which would be the black pig of pink literature. There is one essayist, very good, who lives in Tijuana, and he's doing a PhD right now in South Cal, which is called Heriberto Yepes, and he's wrote a lot about Mexican society, about Mexican politics, and I think that he's a very leftist and militant thinker. Sometimes he might, for some people, sometimes he might overdo it, but he's quite original and he's very well prepared, and I think he's very smart. There is also this writer called Juan Pablo Villalobos, who did a novel that's doing very well also in foreign markets, called Fiesta en la Madriguera, which is the story of the son of a drug lord. It's told. There are many books about drug lords, and we're a bit fed up with all that. But this one's a bit original because it's told by the perspective of a 9-year-old kid. So he's pretty smart. Well, if you want to understand Mexico City, you should definitely read J.M. Servin.
I recommend him too, listeners.
Sure. He's like the master of the low life in Mexico City. Well, David Lida as well. He's written a lot about Mexico City. There's another journalist who I think two. I would end up with 2 writers. One that is very well known in the United States right now, which is Roberto Bolaño, and another one is a journalist who wrote a book called how do you translate that? Desert Bones, something like that, or Bones in the Desert, which is about all the women killing in Ciudad Juárez. So he was the first journalist to say there's something very, very nasty going on there. And he inspired Roberto Bolaño to write 2666.
Yes.
Well, I think if you get started with that, if you start with that, it will get you going. But there are many. I mean, there are like 10 or 12 good Mexican writers right now. So I don't think it's been like that forever.
How do you see Mexico City differently from when you were growing up to now? Do you think this is a different city from the one you grew up in, or do you simply see the place differently?
It's a completely different place. I mean, it's the first place where gay marriage was become legal. It's the first place where abortion became legal. You know, there's been a huge work done by the past administrations, which, I mean, they've had their obscure sides, like pretty much every administration everywhere in the world. But the good side of it is that they've done a lot of work on recuperating the public spaces. You know, we were talking earlier about the transformation of downtown in LA. Something very similar happened here in Mexico City. The downtown area used to be like one of the most dangerous areas of the city, and right now it's probably the most fascinating area in the whole city. There are at least 10 great museums that range from the most avant-garde contemporary art to, you know, the National Museums is about like more classical art, and there are heaps of galleries, cool bars like jazz music bars, and there are many of the architecture of the Colonia, which is pretty impressive. Some of it is hidden in these neighborhoods that are used to be like the outskirts of the old city, and they still have I would say like this atmosphere of a middle or low class how you say like suburbs. You know, there's like these big markets on the street, like people who don't pay taxes, who might be selling illegal stuff, but that support the economy of hundreds of thousands of people, you know. And many of the architectural gems of the city are like buried in these places that are very hard to access. And so like the government has been trying to, with different levels of success, they're trying to, you know, organize the commerce and possibly put them together in some place, and then allow the people who walk in the streets to walk in the streets. And so the city is I think it's recuperating a lot of the buildings that they used to have, old churches, and Reforma. It's like it's becoming more and more a place where people can walk and ride bikes. You know, it's like people are getting the city back. So I think that's probably the biggest transformation in Mexico City, the recuperation of the public space.
Do you sense that more of that is coming in the future, that 10 years from now the city will have been improved in that way even more than it has been? Do you see a bright future for it, I guess we can say?
I'm a bit skeptical about it because you know, it's also a very big city with a lot of problems. We have a lot of places where there is a big water problem. You know, as I was saying, we are beginning to get frightened by the fact that the whole drug dealing thing is getting closer and closer and closer to the city. But I'm also optimist to say that I see many people younger than me, like 25, 26, 27 years old, opening up galleries, opening up small bookshops. You know, there are writers under 28 that are doing brilliant jobs. There are filmmakers. We have at least 10 great cultural festivals. Like we right now there is a big documentary festival called Ambulante going on in the city, and the artistic movement keeps my spirit up. Whereas the political, in the political realm, I'm a bit skeptical because there is the corruption is still absurd, the impunity is still immense. So I think that we cannot talk about bright future until we manage to keep an eye on our on the people who are at the government better, a closer look at them, to be able to manage our public finances better. But I think it's going to be an interesting city, that's for sure.
Do you think literature plays a part in making people aware of the fact that they need to keep an eye on this corruption or on what's going on above them politically?
Yeah, I think so. And not only literature. Last year there was a film called Miss Bala, which was one of the bravest films that we've seen in Mexico for some years now, and it showed, like, in a very precise manner, the levels of corruption in the Mexican government and the level of influence that drug dealers have in the government, which is much bigger than which most people are willing to admit. And I think so. Just look at the last elections. The last elections, there was this student movement called 132, which shut down Televisa, which is the biggest TV network, for a couple of days. Because there were, like, many signs that Televisa had a deal with the actual president right now, with Enrique Peña Nieto. It wasn't very clear afterwards in which ways the deal was done. But there was people speaked up for the first time in many, many years, possibly since the 68 and 71, where students there were two very big student killings. There hadn't been many public manifestations like the ones we had last year during the elections. So I do see, like, we have an expression here. We called it sociedad civil, which is like a civilian society or something like that.
Civil society, we would say in English, very similar.
Oh, okay. That, the first time we used that expression was after the earthquake in '85. Carlos Monsiváis, which was possibly the biggest intellectual figure in Mexico of the past 30 years, when people, the whole city collapsed, after the earthquake, and the response for the authorities was no. They were very slow, they were very erratic, and they were very bad, as pretty much they always are. And people started organizing themselves. They organized, like, rescue squads. They would open up their houses to form shelters for people who had lost their homes. And so in '85, Carlos Monsiváis used the expression, the power of civil society. And I see an awakening of the civil society. It's still not strong enough. I think it has to become more and more strong, because we just can't take it anymore. If you were aware of the news that's been going on in the past couple of months in Mexico, it's just outrageous. We have corruption cases of governors, stealing $500 million, $700 million. Just yesterday, the union leader of the educational system got thrown into jail because they found out that she had deviated funds that belonged to the union to personal accounts for an amount of more than 2,000 million pesos, which is about $150 million. But we have union leaders like that in Pemex, which is the national oil company. We have union leaders like that in the electrical union, the guys who provide electricity for the whole country. We have like that in miners. We have in the railroads. It's pretty much everywhere. We have guys like these ones. These guys were used by the former ruling party to for electoral purposes. They would bribe them. They would bribe them with huge amounts of money, and then they would manage for them to take all the people who belong to the union and vote in their way. That has to stop. And I do see an awakening of civilian consciousness in Mexico, but it has to. We're not even halfway through. I mean, it has to go bigger and bigger and bigger. And I do see that the cultural manifestations, artists, writers, filmmakers are playing a big role on it.
And finally, in your own personal reading, when you need a writer exciting enough to take your mind off the corruption in Mexico for a moment, who do you read these days?
Well, I'm reading Bruce Chatwin, the British writer who did these 2 amazing trips to Patagonia and to Australia. I'm reading right now The Songliners. I'm a big fan of American literature, so I like postmodern American writers like John Gaddis, Thomas Pynchon, John Bart. I like also, I'm a very, very big fan of Malcolm Lowry. I try to read it every 2 years. I try to go back to Under the Volcano. And I'm very fond of Japanese literature too, but right now I'm reading Bruce Chatwin.
I've been speaking here in Colonia, Roma with Diego Rabasa, who is the public face of the press Sexto Piso, which he founded with his brother and others over 10 years ago now, had its 10th anniversary in January, no?
In September.
In September?
September 2012.
Excellent. Diego, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Colin.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everybody who backed Season 3 on Kickstarter, including Paige Calvert, Jonathan Crow, Douglas Dollars, Paul Doyle, John French, Eric Graham, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Kimberly Hahn, Carl Haley, Stefan Halperin, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovenick, Mark Hines, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Matthew Lickey, Mr. Munverzi, Rob Motz, Lindsay Muniak, Daniel Murphy, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Blake Riley, Rob Schultz, Cam Smith, Small Demons, Todd Shimoda, Kevin Smokler, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.